Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute. Good morning. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and we're delighted to have this distinguished audience and even more distinguished set of speakers today for our conference on the Plaza Accord and monetary cooperation today. We have many stars on the program, but I just want to emphasize that obviously international monetary cooperation and specifically the journey to the Plaza and the journey from the Plaza are things that the Peterson Institute in its prior life was directly involved with, and we were very proud of our history in that. Fred Bergston and others here who have contributed so much to that and that issue through the years. We had the opportunity, working with Russell Green of Rice University, to put together a volume, International Monetary Cooperation, Lessons from the Plaza Accord after 30 years, that we're releasing today. And the editors, Fred and Russell, will be up in a second just to say briefly what's in the volume. Some of the papers from that, particularly those by my colleagues, will be spoken about today. But both the volume and today's event are standalone. There's certainly enough material there for all of us. The goal today is to sort of go beyond the chatter that's been in the papers the last couple weeks of, oh, has there been a secret deal made in the G20 for monetary cooperation, which I think anyone who's been in a G20 room would quickly tell you is extremely difficult to imagine. But nonetheless, it might be something worth aspiring to, and maybe there is a basis for that in today's world. Clearly, the Federal Reserve is making remarks indicating a much higher regard for the impact of the dollar on the U.S. economy than, say, 30 years ago Paul Volcker did when the dollar shot up hugely in the 80s and led to Jim Baker and many other people in this room pursuing the Plaza Accord. We are very fortunate to have our board member and General Secretary of Economic Policy, Lawrence Summers, with us today to start us off. We were able, luckily, to get on his calendar, and he will, in a moment, we will start off with a conversation with him about the issues of international monetary cooperation and what he is looking for from the exchange rate system and from the G20 heading into obviously the spring IMF meetings, but the more fundamental economic choices. We will follow that with a panel looking backwards but forwards on how successful was the Plaza, what directly are the lessons we could take. The speakers will be introduced at that time, but we're very fortunate not only to have Russell Green, but James Boughton of CG, Center for International Governance Innovation, who also the center is co-hosting with us today along with Rice. Karen Johnson, the former Director of International Finance at the Federal Reserve Board, and David Smick, author of The World is Curved, and person who actually made more difference with a single conference than I think anybody else I can remember. So we will be having them on the initial time. We also then have a second panel after lunch. I won't forget lunch, don't worry, with my colleagues Fred Bergson and Joe Gagnon, Harold James of CG in Princeton, and Fabrizio Saccomanni, who's a distinguished visiting fellow with us, and of course, former finance minister of Italy and was active at the Bank of Italy when the Plaza and Louvre were underway. So it's a very exciting program. This is all on the record. This is all being streamed live. There will be plenty of opportunities for our audience present to ask questions and make comments if they are brief. But first, let me turn over to Fred Bergson for a few remarks, both on the Plaza and on the project.
Thanks, Adam. And just very briefly, as Adam said, this project was occasioned by the 30th anniversary of the Plaza Agreement last September. The Baker Institute at Rice University, in honor of its founder, Jim Baker, the architect of the Plaza, decided to hold a conference to do a retrospective and particularly to try to draw implications for the future. Russell Green was the point man on the project for the Baker Institute. He'll follow me and just give a few more words on the conference itself. We here at the Institute were delighted that three of us, Ted Truman, who's not here, Joe Gagnon, and myself, were asked to prepare papers and then subsequently asked to publish the volume from the Institute, co-edit it. I did with Russell. The objectives, as I say, were simple. First was to hear from the architects of the Plaza Agreement itself, their recollections of how it came together and what it meant at the time, and whatever inferences they wanted to draw for the future. Jim Baker himself gave the keynote address, which is chapter 1 in the volume. You'll find it fascinating reading because Jim, who's 85, is still right on top of things, keenly interested, and gave us some very spirited remarks about both the plaza itself and what might be done today in that same spirit. Also, in the part 1 of the book are the people who put together the Plaza Agreement under Baker's leadership. David Mulford, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, was my successor once removed, later moved to be Undersecretary when that job was created. But he and Charles DeLaura actually did the main negotiating to prepare for the plaza over the previous 2 or 3 months in total secrecy. The agreement was sprung in secret to the world in September 1985. Mulford and DeLaura also have their recollections in here. We also have recollections by Utsumi-san, who was one of the key Japanese participants. He was their man at the embassy here, the finance ministry's man in the embassy here, later became state secretary, deputy minister in the finance ministry. Japan, as you may or may not remember, was the key foreign participant. The protectionist pressures that triggered the plaza were aimed largely at Japan. Japan was the most eager, active interventionist, participating along with the U.S., indeed doing the bulk of the actual intervention in the exchange markets to move the exchange rates in the way that the plaza agreed. Utsumi has his recollections in here from the Japanese perspective. So that's section 1 of the book. It's by the architects. It's fascinating reading. Section 2 is an appraisal of the Plaza Agreement by some of our top international economists, Jeff Franco, Barry Eichengreen, Taka Ito, again from Japan, analyzing how the plaza worked, what it meant, did it succeed, what were its results. The basic conclusions from practically all of the analysts was that the plaza was a unique success in the annals of international monetary cooperation because there was a common purpose agreed by the participants. There was an agreement to get the dollar exchange rate down sharply in order to correct the current account imbalances that had skyrocketed to, at that time, unheard of levels, and in turn had spawned enormous protectionist pressures in the Congress, which threatened the openness of the global trading system. So it was those 3 events, the exchange rates, the current accounts, the protectionist trade pressures, that motivated the activities at the plaza, which are depicted in that section 2 in the book. The 3rd section of the book then draws lessons for the future. Joe Gagnon and I did papers in that context. John Taylor has one on the implications for cooperation in national monetary policies. Agnes Bernacy has one on the implications for the global reserve currency system and the like. So those are the 3 main sections of the volume. I'm delighted that we're releasing the book today. We have copies for you. By way of history, I might remind you that we published the book at the time that analyzed the Plaza and the subsequent Louvre agreements by Yoichi Funabashi, at the time the Asahi Shimbun's leading columnist on international economic and foreign affairs. He interviewed every single participant in the Plaza process, the ministers, the governors, and their deputies, one exception. Everybody else he interviewed, and did the definitive book on the Plaza Agreement at the time, and all of us used that as fundamental reference to our work today. So that's the outline of the book. Let me just introduce quickly Russell Green from the Baker Institute at Rice University, who really gets full credit for organizing the conference, pulling it together, co-edited the volume with me, and will be part of our program today. Russell.
Well, thank you, Fred, Adam, and the Peterson Institute in general for having me today. It's been a tremendous honor to be affiliated with the Peterson Institute on this project, and they've been tremendous partners. I thought I would just talk a little bit about how this project came to be. So I'm there at the Baker Institute, the James A. Baker Institute, and Baker is, as Fred mentioned, still very active. And somebody mentioned a couple years ago that it was going to be the 30th anniversary for the Plaza Accord, and this light bulb just went off. And I think it's mostly been a matter of being at the right place at the right time, because we were able to pull in, as you can see from the volume, just this superstar group of people to talk about the Plaza Accord, both historically and what it means today, and to get them to all come to Houston, of all places, to do it. And so we were very fortunate to be able to take advantage of this, and the Peterson Institute has been tremendously supportive, and so I really want to appreciate, express my appreciation to the Peterson Institute, and especially to Fred for his help in co-editing the book. For me, this is a fun book to have. For Fred, this is probably one of 3 books he'll publish this year. He's got to be the hardest working guy in international economics, and he also knows how to put on a good show, so you might think of him as the James Brown of international economics, the hardest working man in international economics, but he's been a pleasure to work with. So we had a great group of people to work with, all very collegial, but I thought I would just give one very brief anecdote about how this project came together. We made the mistake early on of asking the entire group of authors what we should call the volume. And I tell you, if I could have one piece of advice, it's don't ask 12 different economists for input on a simple question, like what should the volume be called, because we couldn't even agree on whether it was the Plaza Accord or the Plaza Agreement. And so we went back and forth, and Ted Truman was solidly in the Plaza Agreement camp, and made the very strong argument that you already have the Louvre Accord, and that was, without question, the Louvre Accord, and then you can't have the Plaza Accord as well, because that's 2 accords. If you have 2 accords, that's an accordion. And, I didn't know what to say to that. So finally, Agnes Benassi, she weighed in, and she's not a native English speaker, and so she said that she didn't understand what all this debate was about, and consulted her French to English dictionary. And when she did, the definition that they gave of accord was agreement. And so then we all realized that we were sort of, getting a little bit too ridiculous. And so we consulted Google, and so Accord won by like 10 hits to 1 over Plaza Agreement. And so that's where we are today. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of the flavor of how this came to be. I'll save all the serious discussion for later on in the program. But thank you very much, and I guess we have Domenico.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you, Adam and Fred, for asking us to partner on this important conference. We at CG value very much the partnership with the Peterson Institute and the relationship that we have been able to forge with you and your colleagues on a number of projects. So turning to today's topic, it so happens that we often talk, discuss, or refer to international economic cooperation. But actually the instances in which such cooperation has materialized over the latest few decades are very limited. And I think the excellent book that Russell and Fred have co-edited do highlight this point, with the Plaza Accord or Agreement being defined by Fred as the totem of international economic coordination. So, however, much has happened since then, since the Plaza Accord, since 1985. First of all, the sheer size of today's private capital flows and their unique ability in driving market expectations, central banking decisions. And despite current clouds in the global economy, the role of emerging economies, which have accounted for the bulk of global economic growth in the latest few years. And as a result of that, new consultative processes have emerged, the G20 first of all. So this is why I think, at least from my own vantage point, what I would like to accomplish in today's deliberations is to try to gather a better understanding, maybe even a consensus on the factors that would allow to replicate the successful Plaza experience, if at all, if it can be replicated. in today's much more complex world, in particular by looking at the global political and economic landscape that would be conducive to that in today's world, and the technology of such a cooperative exercise in today's world, namely its scope, the players, central banks versus fiscal authorities, and finally its timing, preemptive interventions versus reactive interventions. So without any further ado, Adam, I would turn over to you. And again, thank you very much for asking us to partner on this important conference.
Thank you, Domenico. Thank you all for bearing with us. This is a multi-partner project, and we are grateful to once again be partnering with CG, which is playing such an important role in promoting issues of international economic governance. And in that context, they were the right partner for us on this occasion. The honor now falls to me of introducing the Honorable Lawrence Summers. Currently, Dr. Summers is President Emeritus and the Charles W. Eliot University Professor at Harvard University. He directs the university's Masavar Ramani Center for Business and Government. When I was in grad school, it was just the Center for Business and Government, so they've moved up. In addition to serving as the 71st Secretary of the Treasury in the Clinton administration, he, of course, served as Director of the White House National Economic Council in the Obama administration, as President of Harvard University, and as Chief Economist of the World Bank. Larry has generously served on our board and now on the Executive Committee of the Institute's board for many years, and I rely on his advice and his occasional correction. Correction of me, not me correcting him. Of interest beyond today, as some of you may be aware, he also recently chaired the Commission on Global Health, and you may have seen a paper that he and co-authors just issued on the risk of global pandemics. One always feels a little strange talking about economic issues in the face of global warming and global pandemics and civil war, but in the end, we have to try to do as best we can on the issues that we can control and we care about, and we're looking forward to today, not just a conversation with Larry, but everybody involved trying to advance us to a more stable international economic system. So can I invite Larry Summers up to the podium, up to the stage for a conversation? Is it on? Well, again, thank you, Larry, for making time for us on this occasion. You've discussed with a number of us in the past the issues of international monetary cooperation. Obviously, what gives this issue salience right now, in particular, is the temptation countries have to adopt straight-up bigger-thy-neighbor policies in a time of declining aggregate demand. It is also, of course, less acute than it was, say, in 2008 to 2010. But this issue of potentially having beggar-thy-neighbor behavior in the face of the next negative shock is one that I think concerns us and concerns a number of policymakers. How do you see this issue? Is there any hope in staving off this threat, or is this a threat we should not worry about?
Let me first just join the general chorus of approbation for this conference and for this kind of inquiry, and say that Fred was uncharacteristically bashful in not emphasizing his own role and the role of the Institute in bringing us to the point of the Plaza Agreement. I think it's one of the major examples of think tanks having a substantial influence on the political process, and noting Fred's prior service in the Democratic administration and the fact that we had a Republican administration at the time, it is also a tribute to a kind of bipartisanship of which we have less than we once did. And so I think the Institute's to be commended for that 30 years ago, and it's to be commended for keeping the fires alive. And it's probably true, as I joke from time to time, that the Institute has never met an initiative it didn't like, has never met an agreement it wasn't in favor of, and has never believed that the right thing to do was to stand still and let markets operate at any moment in its 35-year history. And those are, I think, actually fair observations, but it's actually probably constructive in a world where most people are directed at creating inertia,
Right.
for there to be some people who are never in favor of inertia, even when inertia is the right thing. With respect to your question, I would say 2 or 3 different things, and then try to come to a bit of an overall conclusion. The first is that all of this potentially becomes much more important in a secular stagnation, zero lower bound era. In normal times, if something happens that pushes the U.S. into current account deficit, the impact on aggregate demand can be sterilized with easier monetary policy. If something happens that constrains, that sends somebody else into surplus and overheating, the impact can be sterilized with monetary policy. If monetary policy is not a truly independent instrument because of the zero lower bound, then all of this becomes much more consequential. The same arguments that fiscal policy has a much higher multiplier because the LM curve is flat, to put it in technical terms, when we're at the zero lower bound, also implies that international economic interactions are that much more important at the zero lower bound. And so in that respect, these issues are much more important than they have been traditionally. Second observation, as between the view that I'm going to describe 2 polar views, and then I'm going to tell you where I come down between them. One view is that the zero lower bound means we're in the liquidity trap, it means monetary policy is impotent, and it means there's not much monetary policy can do. That's what's implicit in my remarks, in the first point I made. The other view is the one that the Fed came close to expressing in the last few weeks, which is, at some points, which is, well, zero is just another number. Rates can be negative. If rates can't be too negative, you can always do quantitative easing, and that's kind of the same thing. If you can't do quantitative easing, then you can do forward guidance. And so there's always a way, and there's just a spectrum of monetary policy responses, and so monetary policy can really adjust. And there's nothing particularly special about being at the zero bound. And so those are 2 polar views. My view would be that truth is closer to the liquidity trap pole than it is to the you can always move pole. That's because once long rates are down well below 2, once the 10-year Treasury is down well below 2, how much lower can you really take it? How much investment really is there that people will undertake at a 1 1/4 10-year rate that they wouldn't undertake at a 1 3/4 10-year rate? And whatever the spending is that they would undertake at 1 1/4 and they would not undertake at 1 3/4, how good is it? So I think that for that variety of reasons, it is, as well as a range of political type constraints, it's probably better to think of monetary policy as heavily constrained right now. And I think the looming specter over the international monetary system is this. Sometime in the next 3 years, it is nearly certain that in some major country there will be a recession. Traditionally, interest rates decline in the 400 basis point range to respond to recession. Even on an optimistic view about the capacity of non-standard monetary policies, we do not have 400 basis points of room and will not have 400 basis points of room when the next recession comes in any important place. And so we need to be thinking about how to respond when that day comes now. Indeed, if one believes, and I think it can be rather overdone, but if one believes the central themes of contemporary academic macroeconomics with their emphasis on forward-looking behavior, the knowledge that we will not be able to respond effectively to the next recession should have a significant impact on the level of aggregate demand today. So I think we are living with secular stagnation, and we are living with the specter of much more serious secular stagnation constraints in the future. So, yes, I think it is a good idea to seek to constrain aggressive beggar thy neighbor policies to the extent that it is possible to do so. I think there are a variety of difficulties in doing that. How should one conceptualize easier monetary policies in countries that are well below their inflation targets and that do not, and that have the consequence of reducing exchange rates? I think it is very difficult to define those as sinful. I think the most important international monetary lesson of the 1930s is that, roughly speaking, all the people who were trying to keep people stay on the gold standard themselves or keep others on the gold standard because they feared beggar thy neighbor spirals were on the wrong side of history. And all the people who were on the side of let's have liquidity and get off some international regime that's constraining us from having liquidity were on the right side of history. So I think we need to bend over backwards to avoid making the mistake of, in the name of preventing beggar thy neighbor policies, stop the successful country-by-country pursuit of expansionary monetary policies. I do not relate to the analogy between the U.S. current account deficit of this moment and the situation that preceded the Plaza. I do not see anything that remotely approaches the hyper non-competitiveness of U.S. firms relative to their competitors in other major countries that was such an important impetus for the Plaza Agreement. I think it is very important that there be a norm that would mitigate against anybody's attempt to contrive a currency depreciation for aggregate demand stealing without a genuine and legitimate domestic motivation. And I think the sense that there's going to be a substantial political price for that is helpful in establishing a norm. I am skeptical of the idea that there are large major sinners with respect to that right now. I think it was half a dozen years ago reasonable to believe that Chinese exchange rate management had and reserve accumulation had a significant mercantilist element. I advised President Obama that in terms of actual impacts on the economy, a little bit of exchange rate progress was worth a vast amount of 301ing and anti-dumping investigations and the like. I am quite prepared to believe that the hardworking scholars at the IIE, at the Peterson Institute, could make a case that there are some countries with populations of in the low mid double digits that are sinners, and I'm not in a position to evaluate them on a country by country basis. The largest bit of questionable exchange rate alignment in the world in this period seems to me not amenable to anything that's got much to do with an analogy to the Plaza, and that is the exchange rate of Germany.
Yeah.
Germany has an exchange rate that renders Germany hyper competitive. That is, I think, both a problem, primarily has been a problem within Europe, although I suspect the high point of that problem was several years ago. And because Germany is a large part of Europe, it impacts Europe's impact on the rest of the system. On the other hand, like, we want to have a currency union. We had a currency union. The currency union started 18 years ago. It started 17 years ago, and we're sitting there with the same exchange rate. Like, it's pretty hard to call that like an act of exchange rate manipulation and competitiveness. So I think this is an area that's probably more about prevention than cure, and the establishment of cultural norms is, it seems to me, a very important part of the solution. And the fact that amidst a rather troubled world, not even Fred can find a country he really badly wants to see the dollar depreciate against, suggests to me that the world is actually achieving that cultural norm in a reasonably satisfactory way.
No, I think, Larry, and as you know, Peterson Institute has certain characteristics and tendencies, but one of them is to have disagreements, including on this issue. So some of us were willing to give others a pass before some others. But anyway, I think I want to push you a bit on sort of the rosy place you came out. Speaking for myself, I personally believe that. I think the G20 agreement, G7, first the G7 agreement, and now creeping into the G20 of this norm, I think has been very effective. And if we look at Prime Minister Abe in Japan, who, as Fred noted, Japan was a key player last time, has come out very strongly and said he's not looking to depreciate the currency now. And the Chinese government has seemed to repeatedly say they don't want to depreciate the currency now. So I agree with you. It seems like a victory. But I want to take you back a second to things you were saying earlier. You expressed some concern about the norm in the 30s was the gold standard regime, but the norm of we don't want to do aggressive policies because we're worried about these spirals. Do you see a risk for China in particular, or Japan, that they, in a sense, are, I don't want to make them sound selfless, but in a sense they may be sacrificing too much in terms of their own domestic policies by not doing enough on the monetary policy? Or are you saying that's moot because, except for China, the monetary policy is impotent? Sorry, I made it too long, but basically.
Okay, I'll say some things that are kind of responsive, I think.
Okay.
If you'd made it real clear, then I wouldn't have been able to kind of avoid the stuff I wanted to avoid. So I like the way you asked the question.
Oh, good. Thanks.
So I'd say a few things. First, everybody needs to approach all this with a lot of humility. Basically, Japan just sort of surprised everybody with a monetary easing move in terms of negative interest rates. And kind of in the wake of that move, the currency substantially appreciated rather than depreciated. And so just anybody who's like confidently pronouncing about we should do this about the monetary policies or that about the monetary policies needs to get some humility in the face of that in the face of that observation. I don't see how right now, after Japan did a domestic monetary easing, and the effect of it was that the currency appreciated by 5%, anybody can be mad at them for doing beggar thy neighbor stuff. They managed to do what the theory says is kind of impossible, right, which is a domestic monetary policy expansion that reduced their own competitiveness. And so it's hard to be mad at them. I mean, it's the kind of thing that diplomats who don't know anything about economics propose people do, and that economists usually say is not possible. Look, I think the Chinese dilemma is of a different sort, because it seems to me that China's interests, as I understand them, and the world's interests are relatively aligned. China, for reasons of showing people who are in charge to be in control of events, and for reasons of avoiding substantially extrapolative expectations, does not want to see a substantial rapid depreciation in their currency. And the rest of the world, for reasons of competitiveness and beggar thy neighbor, does not want to see a substantial depreciation in their currency. So everybody kind of agrees about what they'd like. The problem is the classic problem whenever you have managed currencies, which is, as I've said many times before, devaluations are a bit like have something in common with amputations. You really want to avoid them. You really want to avoid them a lot. But if you're going to have them, the worst thing is to have them come too late. And that's the problem. The problem is it's always the problem with an exchange rate peg. If the thing can't be held, it's better not to have run down your reserves completely and not to have dissipated your credibility in the defense of the indefensible. And so I think China is managing and playing this in a reasonable way, but I don't think this is an issue this is not an issue that's primarily about China's interests and the rest of the world's interests being opposed. Mm-hmm. It's a matter that's about China's interests and the rest of the world's interests standing in less than completely certain relationship to the laws of economics and the desire of capital to look forward and find the places with higher rates of return. I don't think that if I were in China's shoes, I would today be seeking to engineer a rapid depreciation. But the primary reason for that judgment is not a judgment about international comity.
Right.
It's a judgment about domestic interest. At the same time, as an observer of the situation from the outside, I don't think that one can preclude the possibility that the on and off character of capital flow pressure will at some point make some more rapid exchange rate adjustment into something that is necessary. And I guess I am very skeptical about the coexistence of a major anti-corruption campaign and a major effort to hold exchange rates with capital controls in a system that is as inherently porous as the system in China.
Interesting. You've indicated that we've gotten to a good place and in the major economies, but you raised again the issue of managed exchange rates more generally. Leaving aside whether Korea or Singapore is a threat to the U.S. well-being with their exchange rates, just for their own sake, some people we very much respect, like Stanley Fischer, others in the past had at times advocated very hard solutions, hard corner solutions for these types of economies, the dollarization or hard pegs. What do you think, if you are a Korea, a Singapore, a Switzerland now, how do you figure in this situation? What should you be thinking about? I mean, should you be managing your float aggressively, or what are your options?
So I don't presume to want to make a prescription for economies, for any economy where I've, on a lifetime basis, spent less than 2 weeks.
Very fair. I wish more economists did.
It just seems to me to be a good discipline that we should all consider holding holding ourselves to. Yeah. I was during my time at the Treasury tended to be an advocate of corner solutions.
Right.
I thought that floating exchange rates were a good idea, and I kind of understood that. And I thought that if you could really lock in on a fixed exchange rate, that was a good idea too. And I thought when you had something that was in between, there was a strong tendency for it to harden up as a peg, but not hard enough that you could ultimately sustain it. And it invited all kinds of dangerous financial pressures because people didn't see the risks in the currency volatility because it was being suppressed. They borrowed heavily in hard currency and the like. When the thing was in trouble, the local oligarchs figured it out before everybody else did and got their money out. And so I lived through a period where the Mexican intermediate regime ended in tears, the Brazilian intermediate regime ended in tears, the Thai intermediate regime ended in tears, and others. And so I came to that view. Looking back, I don't fault myself for having come to that view, and I think there's a lot of truth in that perspective, and there's a lot of reason to be cautious about intermediate regimes. I'd say there are two substantial qualifications that I would talk about a little differently today than I would have at that time. One is, I think I'd be a little more nervous about the hard peg edge of the continuum. When I took that view, Argentina was looking pretty good. And that wasn't an unreasonable thing to think in 1998, but looking back from the perspective of today, the Argentine hard peg ended in tears.
Yes.
And so you have to have really hard pegs. Currency boards aren't quite enough, maybe is what you think. And then you look at the EU, and the euro area, And that hasn't exactly been a smashing success in the way that its progenitors hoped. So I think I would have a longer list of necessary requisites before you could have a hard peg than I would have had I been than I did when I addressed this in the 1990s. And I think the second thing is I'd probably be a little more sympathetic to managing your exchange rate upwards against appreciation, and would distinguish between a dirty float where you are preventing appreciation and a dirty where in some sense you don't have the constraint of having a limited quantity of reserves, and where if you get off it, the day you get off it, nothing calamitous is going to happen. And so I would be a bit more sympathetic to resistance than I would be to resistance to depreciation. And I would draw that distinction somewhat more strongly than I would have in the 1990s. So I'd say I'd still have the same views, but in a somewhat modified form. I think I would continue to put great emphasis on, and still believe, a point that I used to make very often in the 1990s, and I've made since, nobody's really convinced me I'm wrong, but nobody's really ever seemed nearly as taken with the point as I am. So maybe I am wrong. And that is, there's all this discussion of capital controls. And there's a lot you can say about that, and maybe we'll get a chance to say a little bit of it. But it's always seemed to me that the first principle, just like we should have an agenda of getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies before we have an agenda of raising carbon prices. Like, we should raise carbon prices, but like the place to start the conversation is by getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. In the same way, it seems to me that most of the countries that get themselves in trouble have actively contrived policy non-neutralities in favor of attracting short-term dangerous capital because they think it's cheap. I mean, go through the crisis countries. Mexico with the Tesabonos. What was a Tesabono? It was basically a contrivance to attract hedge fund money. What was a Russian GKO? Customized for the benefit of hot money. What was the Bangkok International Banking Facility about? Customized for the benefit of money. I no longer remember just how the institution worked, but in Brazil, 6 months before the devaluation, they were carefully designing their instruments to attract short-term money. Korea, on political grounds, wanted to date foreign money, not to marry foreign money. So they had rules that basically were very permissive with respect to short-term capital flows and very non-permissive with respect to long-term capital flows. And so I guess the first piece of advice I would give that class of countries is that if you create non-neutralities designed to dine with short-term capital, you're likely to end up on the menu. And that is a kind of first principle before you get to the exchange rate question, before you get to the capital controls question.
Terrific. We'll hope your point sticks this time. One final question, bringing it back to international monetary cooperation before we open it to the audience. So countries of that class, including some larger countries of that class like Brazil and India, have expressed concern that they're not getting enough consideration or cooperation from the Fed in general. Your friend Governor Rajan from the Reserve Bank of India just made another call for some form of additional monetary cooperation from the large advanced economies versus these other economies. what do you think of that call? Is there something there that we should be worrying about? Do we need a regime, or is this just a communications issue that the Fed has to say, we share your pain, we hear your story, and we'll try not to do too much to you? I mean, how should we think about this?
I've worried about that, and I've talked to a number of the people in emerging markets, and I don't have any view that I hold with a super high degree of confidence. I confess to some frustration. When we keep interest rates low, they seem to think that's like us having a currency war to drive the dollar down. When we raise interest rates, they seem to think that's like sucking the capital out of their economies. I mean, the only constant seems to be their displeasure. Their displeasure and their desire for a larger seat at the table. So I find myself having that reaction, that they've got less in the way of conviction as to what we should do than they have in the way of a desire to be at the table, and that's not so great from my point of view. I confess that it made a lasting impression on me when, as the undersecretary or the deputy secretary of the Treasury, in response to this kind of pressure in the 1990s, I persuaded a modestly reluctant Bob Rubin and Alan Greenspan that at the time of one of the annual meetings, it would be terrific to have a forum with a group of emerging market, principally central bankers, but also a little bit of finance ministers. And we planned this forum, and as best I could tell, the principal interest that they had was in learning something from Alan that would help them manage their reserves to greater and more profitable advantage. And I was struck by how similar the questions were to a private sector gathering. That was a long time ago in a different world. But I think one has to be quite careful down this road. And I think that the American people do not want to hear that U.S. monetary policy is being made to maximize global welfare. They do want to hear, and they're kind of entitled to hear, that U.S. monetary policy is being made to maximize American welfare, recognizing that what goes on in the big world has a substantial impact on what happens in the United States. So I think it's a good idea for there to be ever more and close dialogue. One of the things I'm proudest of in my government service in the 1990s is having been one of the people who played a significant role in the establishment and creation of the G20, precisely for this kind of reason. But I'm a little bit puzzled by just why it is what it is that could be done that would make things better. I do think that this is an area where there's room for a fair amount of research in the following sense. I've heard it alleged in India that that everything in India is much more volatile in the week before Fed meetings than in the period after Fed meetings. I don't know whether that's true. I've heard it said of 10-year interest rates in many countries, that they're more sensitive to what the Fed's doing than they are to what the local central bank is doing. So I think the question of the extent of U.S. monetary policy impacts on countries that have flexible exchange rates and their own apparently independent monetary policies is a question that's worth substantial study. And the reason I don't take a stronger position of skepticism is that it wouldn't surprise me if data could be adduced suggesting really a very high degree of sensitivity. And if there is that kind of high degree of sensitivity, then somehow the notion that the global system needs to think about it might well be something that is warranted. But I think on balance, so I think that's a quite important qualification. But I would say on balance, I think it's probably a desire to, a certain amount of this is a desire to externalize responsibility for what are inherently less than fully satisfactory outcomes that are achievable.
A certain amount of misery is inherent for all of us. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Larry.
a certain amount of misery is inherent for all of us, and to the extent that we can find causes outside of ourselves,
right.
That makes us feel better.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Larry. You've graciously offered to do some on-the-record questions with our audience. We just a couple ground rules. We have a traveling mic up front with Jessica. If you raise your hand and be recognized, people towards the back can go to the standing mic. When you ask a question, please be more concise than I was, and please identify yourself, and we'll take it from there. So why don't we have those two gentlemen, if you are mobile, could you go to the back mic, and Jessica, could you give to the man in the green shirt over there? Yeah, please, you go first. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Marty Weiss with the Congressional Research Service. IMF MD Lagarde and several recent IMF papers have kind of been, once again, pushing this argument that the fund should be involved, have a more central role in swap agreements. Is this a good idea?
Swap agreements?
Yes.
You mean central bank?
Central bank swap agreements, short-term liquidity.
I don't have a strong opinion. Why? I kind of suspect that people think that the fund can't completely keep a secret, and I kind of think they're probably right in thinking that. And so I think if the fund insists on being involved, they probably won't. They're probably a little less likely to happen if people have to tell the fund about it and involve the fund in it. So unless there's a compelling gain, I'm not sure that would be among my top 25 priorities for international monetary reform. If people want to tell the fund about their swap agreements, I think that is fine. But I think I believe more in democratic accountability, and so I think the French vision that the sort of management of all things international monetary should be turned into a purportedly apolitical group of technocrats on 19th Street does not strike me as plausible. One of the things I noticed, actually, and maybe in your subsequent discussions this can come up, is the role or non-role of the IMF in the Plaza agreement. Well, I mean, one might have imagined as a political strategy that perhaps the United States should seek to enlist the IMF in the task of encouraging and bringing everybody to this point. If that happened, I missed it in my reading of the volume, and I think those whose theory of how to have better international monetary cooperation is to have a far larger role of the fund do need to ponder the systematic exclusion of the fund from the most successful and extensive instance of monetary cooperation in the last 30 years. There was a practice which I suspect has long since been mooted at the beginning of my time in the G7, in which the managing director would be present for the surveillance discussion, and there would then be a separate exchange rate discussion where people would like talk about intervention and stuff, and the managing director would be excused for that part of the discussion, kind of on the grounds that that was really sensitive and really political and really market oriented, and you really couldn't trust the fund with that. Over time, there basically came to be less and less of that. And so I think that bifurcation of the macro surveillance went away as a practice. But I don't think there'd be a lot of I think swap agreements between central banks as devices for preserving stability are good. I think there wouldn't be a lot of appetite for involving the fund. So trying in a heavy-handed way to force the inclusion of the fund, I don't think would be a too terrific idea.
Great. Dave?
Yeah, hi, David Smick, International Economy, Johnson Smick International. I'm not a big believer like you in conspiracy theories, but I deal every day with currency traders. They, the latest view is that a G2 is emerging. And if you look at, and it's happening coincidentally at around the same time that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have offered blistering criticism of the Chinese. The theory goes that if you look at recent developments, the Chinese, in pivoting toward this basket concept, they have sold yen and euro assets, and they bought yen and euro assets while selling the dollar. And they also, the market mood is, well, this is interesting because this is coincidentally happening at the same time that Janet Yellen has done a pivot, and that where suddenly international concerns are delaying tightening of monetary policy. Now, you may not like to respond to conspiracy theories, but want to take a stab at the concept? Is there a kind of a quiet understanding? And I guess the wild card, is the politics in Europe, and I guess to a lesser extent Japan and elsewhere in reaction to this.
Just before you give your response, just to put a slightly less conspiratorial spin on Dave's question, you made mention of your saying to President Obama, a little exchange rate is better than a lot of 301s. And obviously in our original work on the Plaza and our volume, we stress a lot the fear of protectionism in the U.S. Congress as being a big motivating force to the Plaza Accord. So maybe there is I know David wasn't advocating the conspiracy theory, but maybe there's a more gentle political channel through which this is taking place.
And the dollar, obviously, the dollar-yuan relationship is by far the most watched.
Right.
So that would be kind of part of the thinking of why stabilizing that relationship would be of primary importance to the Chinese.
So there are 2 or 3 aspects to this. So first thing to say is if there was a conspiracy going, I've been out of the official sector for years and nobody would have let me in on the conspiracy. So I have no direct knowledge of which I'm speaking. It's been my observation in 10 years in the U.S. government that vastly more rationality and vastly more capacity for conspiracy is attributed to government officials than they in fact possess. And in fact, one of the things I always say to market participants is, trust me, the official sector, you spend much more time thinking about the official sector than the official sector spends thinking about you. And if you talk to the average market participant, they think like the President of the United States is like spending his time thinking about whether structured products leading to a technical squeeze in the yen at the end of the quarter. And I promise you, I worked for two presidents who are known for being highly intelligent and detail-oriented, and neither of them ever thought about anything that had that character. Just to indulge in one more story. At the time of one of the G7 summits, I think it was the Naples summit, there was an idea in the marketplace that there was going to be some major agreement about the dollar, and we did what you'd expect us to do, which is 4 or 5 days before the summit, we extensively briefed the president that the press that there was going to be no major agreement, so there wouldn't be an expectation of an agreement. And the president said at a press conference that there wasn't going to be an agreement, and the dollar proceeded to do whatever it wasn't supposed to do, fall. I think in this case, fall by 2.5%, and the headlines all said, dollar collapses on presidential comments. So the people who were advised the president on his comments in the White House hated this, and they were very, very unhappy. And they said, what the hell's going on? The president's comments didn't have anything to do with it. And I said, well, let me show you a graph. Let me show you a graph of the dollar. I think if you look, you'll find that the president spoke at 3:32. And I think you'll find that between 3:32 and 3:33, the dollar fell. So that could just be a coincidence, but it seems kind of unlikely. And then they said, so why did this happen? You guys said we'd taken it out. I said, well, the market thinks that it was a bear trap and that we were all setting a bear trap, and that now they learned after the president said this that it wasn't a bear trap. And so when the bear trap hypothesis went away, the currency fell. I remember George Stephanopoulos said, Larry, your friends in the market do not think this administration can organize a 2-car funeral. How could they possibly think that we're going to do an entire conspiracy to outwit the entire global capital market? But so in general, people would, I remember one more. I remember people saying, that was really clever. And they explained to me, somebody explained to me what a really clever strategy we'd had. First, Mickey Cantor had given a speech, then the president had made a remark, and then I, as Secretary of the Treasury, had said something else. And that was a really brilliantly orchestrated 3-part strategy. And in my first years, I would have said you're an idiot. I did learn a thing or two over time, so I did smile. Thank you, I really appreciate that. And then I walked out and I said, did Mickey give a speech that mentioned the dollar? Yeah. Because I had no idea. So conspiracies, no. And I think one of the things another thing that I think is different from the Plaza period is the central banks are much more independent. And so all this, we're all on Team America and Team Europe and all that, half the dynamic nowadays is Team Europe and Team America, and the other half is Team Finance Ministry and Team Central Bankers. And so these central bankers aren't trying to get TPP passed, I promise. I mean, it's just not the way the thing works. Do people have a feeling that some of the international interactions are more important? Has it been noticed that really bad news in China can be really substantially upsetting for U.S. conditions? Yes, that wouldn't surprise me if that's been noticed. But I think the more conspiracy-oriented sides of this are fairly unlikely.
That's great. One last question at the back mic, and then we promised Larry that he has to go. So please.
Thank you, Secretary. My name is Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And the Chinese see Plaza Accord as a miserable lesson, and they blame the agreement for the lost decades of Japan. So in this context, I'm wondering if the United States could persuade China to accept a new sort of Plaza Accord. And secondly, when President Obama met with President Xi last week, they pledged that the two countries should enhance their monetary policy coordination and avoid the competitive depreciation of their currency. I'm wondering, in the context of the economic slowdown in China, how is it possible to do that? Thank you.
I think the idea that the Plaza Accord, which happened in 1985, after which the Japanese market more than doubled and Japan had a remarkable boom, was then the cause of the subsequent events after 1990 is, I think, ludicrous. The idea that Japanese monetary policy was too loose in the context of the Louvre, which went in the opposite direction from the Plaza, and that contributed to the bubbles, which contributed to the problems, I think that's a plausible, that as one element of what contributed to the bubbles is a problem. I think that you have to kind of recognize that we're not in 1993 or 4 anymore. It's easy to say that you built up a big bubble and then the bubble burst, and that was why Japan was had all kinds of problems in the early 90s. 15 years after the bubble burst, that's really not very plausible. And so I think you have to look at much deeper things in Japan. I think we're making the same mistake, by the way, in the United States. We are still, in the United States, attributing things to the aftermath of the financial crisis that are better thought of as a new reality. And so the Fed still has not given up on the idea of temporary headwinds. And I can't imagine what the headwind is that was important in 2015 and 2016, but that you wouldn't guess will continue to be important in 2017 and 2018. I think I already spoke to the question of Chinese, of sort of China and the United States' motivations. It seems to me they're largely coincident. We don't particularly want to see a huge depreciation because of what it would mean for competitiveness and mean for the system, and they don't want to see it. China doesn't want to see it for its own domestic reasons. And so I think the issues go to the issues are of two kinds on China's exchange rate and the risk of a significant depreciation. They are of the political capital flight associated with uncertainty about the future, the anti-corruption campaign, all of that. That's one force. And the other is the impossible trinity, or the trilemma of international macroeconomics, that China has a slowing economy and needs easier money, wants to have capital mobility as a sign of international maturity, and can't really have anything other than capital mobility given its integration in the global economy, and therefore it can't choose a monetary policy and an exchange rate independently, and the necessary monetary policy may make a currency reduction inevitable. I think that's the right way to think about those two things are the right way to think about the risks of a significant decline in the renminbi, not to think about what it is people actively want to have, because there's no large constituency, except for people who are short the currency, for a large and sudden depreciation. But there was no large constituency for World War I either, and it happened. And so by saying there's no large constituency for something, I don't mean that it's a certainty not to happen.
Thank you so much, Larry. Please join me in thanking Lawrence Summers.